Welcome. I don't know about you, but when I'm at a conference, I feel like I'm lost in a jungle. So much variety and ways to grow, yes, but also strange and disorienting. Well, the good news is you'll never feel lost here because this is a conference on social studies, and that is one subject with an incredible infrastructure. I mean, just think about the many organizations that serve teachers of history and social studies. Putting this conference together, it's no easy feat, and it would not have happened without the support of education leaders in Arizona, California, Maryland, Ohio, Oregon, Nebraska, Utah, and Washington, as well as the World History Association. This is a great time to become a member of your local state council for the social studies and join the WHA while you're at it. Membership dues keep them going, and it's a small price to pay for what they offer. So join up, please, and enjoy the conference.
Hi again, everyone. Our last live discussion today is described in just one word: literacy. As social studies teachers, we can't ignore the foundational importance of literacy. In this discussion, our participants will ask how literacy in the classroom deepens student understanding of social studies content and how diverse and inclusive approaches can open up student engagement and ownership of learning. Plus, they'll dive into how different forms of media available, comics, videos, artwork, and photos, engage students in literacy practices during social studies lessons. I'm thrilled to introduce our moderator, Annette O'Boyce. She is a senior national facilitator for the National Center on Education and the Economy and has had a long career in teaching, curriculum development, and the development of national standards. Joining her in conversation today are Hajra, Saeed, and Christina Cautery. Hajra has taught elementary through high school throughout her 21 years of teaching. She is currently teaching Big History and AP Psychology. At the high school where she teaches, Hajra is also a pathway coordinator, working to engage students interested in engineering and biomedical engineering fields through work-based learning experiences. Christina is a teacher, writer, scholar, and runner based in Honolulu, Hawaii. She is currently a teacher at Punahou School and just finished her 10th year in the classroom. She's written for numerous publications and is currently a PhD English student at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Annette, Hajra, and Christina, welcome. So happy to have you. I will turn it over to Annette to get us started.
Hi, Christina and Hajra. I'm so glad to be talking with both of you today. I really enjoyed both of your videos. Your talks were fantastic. And I'm excited to hear more stories about how you're using literacy in your classroom to support your students' deeper understanding of social studies concepts. And I would love, if you wouldn't mind, Christina, if I could turn it over to you immediately and just have you tell us a little bit about your understanding of literacy and how we use literacy in the world.
Sure. Thanks so much for having me, folks. I'm so excited to be here and talking with you all and having this conversation. So I thought a lot about, when I started crafting this talk, I thought a lot about, okay, what is the nitty gritty of literacy? And I did that like very intro to English thing where I was like, the dictionary definition of literacy is, but when you look it up, the dictionary definition of literacy is the ability to read and write in a language. But when I pulled back from that and really sort of sat with that concept, I realized that the concept of literacy at its heart is the ability to express oneself and to understand other people, right? Whether that's text, traditional print text, or other forms of literacy and ways of expressing ourselves and being able to read other forms of expression too. So I know when I think about literacy in my English classroom, like, yes, of course, text is important to me, books, then, printed text, very important parts of literacy. But I also think about what are the ways I'm making sure my kids are literate when they watch things online, when they watch the news, when they're interacting with different forms of marketing, things like that. How can I make sure that my students are able to understand what is actually being expressed and able to express themselves in multiple ways too?
Yeah, having students become critical consumers of all different types of texts is so crucial, especially right now. Hajra, would you want to tell us a little bit about how you use literacy to support students in your classrooms as they work toward a deeper understanding of some of the concepts in your classroom?
Yes, and hi everybody. Thank you so much for being here, and I'm excited, looking forward to this conversation. So for me, literacy in my talk, it's a little bit more narrow, the definition. I focus more on literacy in terms of written text, but of course, literacy is as broad as what Christina was mentioning in her talk. You know, it encompasses a lot more. But for me, literacy is something that's not necessarily language bound. I know it sounds kind of funny to say it, but the kids are trying to make meaning as they are trying to interpret different kinds of text. And so what I mean by not being language bound is that as they're negotiating for understanding, it's okay if they wander into their heritage languages and they explore the topics within that. In fact, it almost shows a higher level of metacognition. And so something I really enjoyed this last year was the interaction between two boys in my classroom. They chose to sit next to each other, and I kind of just let them there to stay there for most of the year because I was enjoying their interaction. They would read the text in English, and as they were trying to figure out what were the main ideas and the essential pieces of evidence, they would switch over to Spanish. And I remember the first time they did that, and I walked by, one of them muttered an apology, and I'm like, no, go for it. If you're talking about the content, you're making meaning. That's the whole point of this process. And then they were able to turn around and then share that information with the class in English. And so for me, literacy in that way is not language bound. It's about, letting the kids express and negotiate understanding in multiple ways. And I think you kind of talk about that too in your talk, Christina. I really like the example that you gave of the hula dancing.
Right. I think so much about, this was another big realization for me as far as like understanding how culture and the hegemony, so like dominant society, has really focused us to think that the main form of expression is printed text. But I work in a place now that uses hula and mele and chant as important ways of expression that actually, and I like briefly touched on this in my talk, but I ended up like falling down this rabbit hole of research about how actually hula and mele, so chant in Hawaiian, actually shape Olelo Hawaii, so the Hawaiian language today. Like what words are used, the way that the language is evolving is actively being shaped by music and by dance and that culture. And so it's so important to remember that the way we express ourselves is so much bigger than just the printed text. And having our students just be open to that is huge, particularly because, and to your point, Hajra, like language is so cultural. I think about my dad who speaks Spanish, and my mom who speaks Tagalog and Pangasinan, which is a Filipino dialect. Like language shifts so much for them when they're switching and code switching. And so it's important to remember that like when we can move beyond printed text, not only is that increasing our different forms of literacy for students, but it's allowing us to be more culturally relevant and responsive, which is hugely powerful as well.
I was very moved, might not be the right word, Christina, in your talk when you were talking about how the world shapes our words and how the words we use shape the concepts in our mind and solidify them. And I thought that was really, really an interesting way to think about it, and how we have to tap into what the kids already know and are bringing into the classroom to kind of make sure that they're able to integrate that new knowledge back into the knowledge base that they have. Hajra, you were talking about metacognition when you were talking about the kids' fluidity in their negotiating meaning in both Spanish and in English. And I'd love to hear more about what's so good about metacognition, and what leads you to appreciate their fluidity between languages to support that metacognition.
So I know that when I started off teaching, I was very like structured and very rigid and how things had to be done, that they had to be done a certain way. And the kids would perform, and some of the kids wouldn't grow as much from that process. And over the years, I started learning about brain-based research and how getting kids to think, learn how they learn, right? And so there's no one prescribed method. I can't stand like music or any sort of noise when I'm reading, but my daughter can't read without her headphones on. And when I ask her what she got out of it, she can explain it beautifully. She loves reading. And so over the years, having my own kids, it kind of taught me, as I observed them, that there's so many modes and ways of learning. And so if you start modeling those ways of learning to the students and thinking aloud and doing a lot of that metacognition work, you start seeing like them grow by leaps and bounds. They feel powerful, they feel like they have agency, and they don't feel like just consumers of information in your class, but actually producers, that they're part of making history in your class, making meaning of it.
They're kind of joining in the conversation. So what are some of the things that you hear kids say that lead you to believe that the way of thinking, rather than just the content, is sticking in their heads?
So an example might be that in the beginning of the year, I'll teach them different ways of thinking and approaching different topics and graphic organizers. And then later in the year, by the second or third quarter, I'm asking them to choose from a list of things. And I hear kids turn around and say to their friends, I think I would learn better if we both read this quietly and then we talked about it together. Or other times, why don't you read this and I read this and we'll share it together. And so they're talking through the process of how they learn best. And I'm fine with it as long as they're making meaning and they're all engaged.
That's terrific. Wouldn't that be terrific if we could do that as adults?
Yeah.
So the connection between literacy, this idea that words shape our thinking and the ideas and how we solidify them. In what ways have you seen the work you do in literacy actually result in the kids' deeper understanding of social studies concepts? Like, why are we having this big conversation about literacy? What's so good about it? Or why do we intentionally support it in the social studies classroom?
You know, that's funny. At the beginning of the year, we do a lot of extra writing activities in class, and the kids are using similar structures in like their English class or their science class. We try to be on the same page in the grade level, and they come in and they're like, oh my gosh, why are we looking at clever again? Or why are we looking at how to annotate again? This is a history class. So I think that that there's a lot of explaining to the kids at the beginning of the year. That these go hand in hand. You can't do history without understanding whatever you're looking at. And so I have to give you the tools, and I'll give you lots of tools, but we can't do the history until you have the tools that you need.
Go on ahead, Christina.
Oh, I was just going to say, and I really love that you make that point, and you keep using this great term, Hajra, meaning making, and it's such an important term when we think about metacognition and when we think about the connection within the humanities, right? Because I think it's really, really important to remember that yes, not only does literacy support social studies and the ability to read things and understand and you know, dig deeper into different and understand the subtext of things that they're reading. And I would also say that social studies and social context is something that's so huge in literature, and understanding literature more deeply, and I feel is sometimes overlooked. I feel like you can't really understand the world of To Kill a Mockingbird without understanding the civil rights movement that it came from. And To Kill a Mockingbird is in some ways an imperfect example, right? But you can't really understand the depth of the poetry of the Harlem Renaissance without understanding the music and the socio-political context that was going on at that time. You know, authors are writing something not just for us to read now, but they were writing for the socio-political world that they were in at that time. So being able to understand that historical and cultural context from where an author is coming from is huge in understanding the nuance of a piece of literature. So I think that not only does social studies need literacy in English for us to help kind of support those spiraling skills of writing and research, but English needs culture and context and social studies to support, hey, here's why the author was doing this. Here's why the author makes this choice. This is what they were saying to the audience of their time, because it doesn't live in a vacuum. It's influenced by the culture around it as well.
That's so true, Christina. I was just thinking about that. It doesn't live in a vacuum. And what's been really helpful for me, like at my school, there's only one other English teacher in my grade level, and there's two of us history teachers, and we plan with her. And she's actually moved around. I can't move around the chronology of history, but she can move around her history, English units, right? So she teaches Things Fall Apart around the time that I'm talking about imperialism, or we were talking about materialism, and when people became more sedentary. And then she went and found texts that supported that claim. And then the kids had to defend that claim in her English class. So working in tandem with the English teacher, showing the kids that they do go hand in hand is really powerful. So when we model that we're collaborating and we're making meaning together as adults, we're doing what they should be doing as students as well.
So I just want to track for a minute two things I'm hearing, because I want to pick up both of them, but let's take one at a time. One is that the making transparent to kids that they're entering into a conversation, for example, about the Harlem Renaissance, that has gone on for 100 years. People have been talking about those texts. And sometimes kids think, writers write things for the textbook, right? That they don't belong in the world beyond the classroom because it might not be as visible to them in their worlds. But that idea that they're entering into a conversation that has been ongoing is something that really speaks to social studies, I think, because you're the ones who contextualize a lot of that and allow them a voice in a conversation that they may not have previously had access to. So how do you open that up for kids so that it doesn't feel like, oh, these old dead guys or whatever they say, right? Like, how do you open it up to say, these are living voices in a way, and you get to have a conversation with Langston Hughes through his poem?
Okay, so and the great example of that was in John Mason's talk when he was talking about it, the different windows, right? And he gave this great example about an event happening and having kids dive in as the reporters, that now they're being the writers of history. So having those opportunities to role play in that time and place, helping them see that this historical content is not just for the textbook, but that this historical event produced all this other residue, like Bob Bain says, right? You have the residue of newspaper articles, and in our age, it'll be TikTok videos and who knows what in the future. But it's going to create all this residue in the process. So help the kids become the producers of that residue. And I think that would be, it was Joe Adraña's talk. That's what it was. That was a great one. So he gives an example of how you can take something that's not like old dead people and make it come alive for the kids.
So I have two things. And the first is a little embarrassing, but I'm still going to share it. But so one way that I get kids into this process, or like the decoding and the analyzation process, is I have them think about literary analysis as a form of treasure hunting, for lack of a better word, or looking for Easter eggs. If you don't know, Easter eggs in a piece of media are like fun little things that the director or the artist will put in to kind of call out to their audience. And one of the biggest users of Easter eggs is Taylor Swift. Taylor Swift loves putting Easter eggs in her videos. Like her All Too Well 10-minute video has all these Easter eggs about Jake Gyllenhaal, her relationship with Jake Gyllenhaal. And that's the kind of thing that I love. And my students love it too. They love looking for these Easter eggs. So I'll play them a little clip of something and I'll let them look for the Easter eggs, and they get really into it. And they're like, oh, when she says this, she's referring to when she and Jake did this and da da da. And I'm like, okay, what you just did is a form of literary analysis. All we need to do is take that skill and apply it to like, oh, hey, when Harper Lee says this, she's actually calling out this, this, and this in Southern Christianity. We're just taking that skill and we're applying it in a new way with a new socio-political context, right? Or a socio-cultural context. And for them, that gets them really excited because they want to find as many like Easter eggs as they can. And they kind of also want to see like where the author was shading people, which for them is like, oh, she was like calling out Southern Christianity. And I'm like, yes, it's awesome. It's great. So that's one way to kind of get them into the process. And then one way that I have them kind of enter that conversation is very much remaking the idea of how to have conversation with texts, particularly through online media. I'll show them like SparksNotes has a hilarious Instagram account where they'll use like memes from TV shows and apply them to like Romeo and Juliet. So I'll have my students do that as a way to like summarize what they read on their own. Like, okay, 20 minutes, make a quick Instagram post. If you were Scout, what happened in this chapter? And it's just a fun way for them to enter the conversation. And they realize that if they were to share that online, they could actually they could drive content that way, right? And so for my students that are interested in driving content, because I do work at a school where students end up often like starting their own businesses or things like that, like that's a powerful skill for them to learn too, that I've seen them use later on, which has been really nice.
That is amazing. It reminds me of the work of Carol Lee on cultural modeling, where you start with something that the kids know how to do, but they don't know the word metaphor, right? Or they don't know the term. You make transparent to them the work that they already do in their own literate lives, and then transfer it over to increasingly more rigorous texts. Really, really appreciate that. We've dug into a lot of it, but before we go any further, I'd love to hear from both of you. We have this treasure in both of you with a very literacy lens and a very social studies lens, right? And the two of you meet in the middle to kind of make transparent for us what are what is the work. You've started to talk about the work of literacy that's common across English or ELA and social studies, but I'd love to hear some of the ways that the work kind of separates in social studies from the work that we do in literacy.
That's a really good question. Yeah. And if we spend too much time in literacy, we're not going to get to all the content. So we're always trying to juggle that, right? And so for me is, once I've kind of laid the foundation with my English teacher, like, can you please talk about counter argument structure or whatever it is, then that frees up time for me to start digging into the other things. I know I need to talk about changes over time, contextualization, looking at things from multiple perspectives. I need to give them historical thinking skills. And so that's where we get into, okay, I know this is how you looked at, we use SpaceCat to dissect texts across our school. And so the English teacher uses SpaceCat, and I'm like, we're just going to use the space portion of SpaceCat. It doesn't really apply to our class, right? SpaceCat is just a little mnemonic device for breaking down text. I think it's used in the AP Lang community a lot. So that's where we come in and start saying, well, now we're going to start looking at this from the historical background. What was going on at that time? What was the space like? And so trying to give the kids the vocabulary and then the language of the discipline for historians too, so that they can start applying those skills that spread across specifically to this. An example might be, that yes, they've learned together how to do cite evidence, but now we're in a history class, we need to corroborate that evidence. We need to go to multiple sources and prove and try to figure out, do we believe this claim? Why do we believe this claim? And so that becomes the work of historians. What information is missing? What we have this residue. I love your Easter egg analogy. I use crime scene all the time. And so I'm like, what are we missing from the crime scene that they left behind for us, right? And that's the work of historians, and that's constantly evolving. So those are some of the things that we try to do.
Christina, that links back for me to your the habits I heard you talk through when you were talking about what voices are we missing in a story, right? Who wrote it, when, but then what voices are we missing? Could you speak a little bit to that?
Absolutely. So one of the things that I try and do with every text that I interact with my students, particularly like our big novels, is I have them think about, both before and after, I have them think about three main questions. Who wrote this? Sometimes it's three questions, sometimes it's four. It breaks around, but generally speaking, who wrote this? Why did they write this? You could also say, like, for whom did they write this? Whose voices are missing from this? And then what are we missing from those missing voices? When I want to take it to another level, I'll also add, like, who benefits from those missing voices. So when I'm thinking about To Kill a Mockingbird, who wrote this? Harper Lee. For whom did she write this? She wrote this generally for progressive white people. And in her time, in my opinion, that is a large point of who she was hoping to catch. whose voices are we missing? For better or worse, like for worse, but like honestly, Harper Lee is missing the voices of the Black people that she was writing about at that time. And so we're missing a lot of that side of the story. And so we unfortunately have some Black characters, as much as To Kill a Mockingbird has touched many of our lives, we have Black characters that come across as fairly one-sided in that story. Lula, for example, is very much this angry Black woman stereotype. And so we're missing kind of a whole aspect of that story and the concept of like 1930s race relations in the South. Who benefits from that? I mean, I would say that like, you know, white dominant society benefits from that, or the idea of the white savior. There's a lot of things you could say. By talking through those questions, my students are able to start thinking about kind of that crime scene aspect, right? What's missing from here? What am I not getting from, like, by allowing students to question the text, I'm allowing them to question the larger society and authority, which I think is huge. And I say that as the authority in my classroom. I want my students to question me. I'm not going to pretend to them I'm not. All humans are biased in some way. That includes me. I want them to feel comfortable questioning me as well. So that's why I think the crime scene was another good thing. Like, what are we missing? What's the missing lens from this? Because I think far too often my students think, oh, because I'm your English teacher and I'm giving you a book, this is a perfect book. This is a model book. This is the best book you can be reading. And I just do not think that is always true. And you know, I'm seeing it in the chat box. There are a lot of reasons why teachers give books, sometimes because that's the only books they have, right? And so how can we use what we have as a way to allow students to expand their minds? Sometimes it's questioning the books that we're reading too, and having that social studies aspect of evidence, research, corroborating is so huge. I mean, Harper Lee, right, when Go Set a Watchman came out, there's all this controversy around, did she even want it published? What was the situation there? That's still answers. Those are still questions we don't know answers to, right? Was this a prequel? Was this a sequel? What was it? You know, how did this work? There are all kinds of questions. So having that research and that corroborating evidence is a huge factor in being able to work well with literature as well. I'm seeing some folks, I know To Kill a Mockingbird touches a lot of us, but I think it's good to question it. That doesn't mean that like it can't have a powerful impact on us, but I think it's also really good to question its place in our canon right now.
Yeah, when you think about residual, one of the things we want our kids to leave with is feeling empowered to ask questions of givens in any place that they're in. Hajra, how do you deal with some of the challenges that you experience, that all of us experience, as you negotiate between literacy? And you talked really clearly about the balance between the historical thinking skills and the literacy. But how do you deal with some of the challenges that we face, working with students and making sure that we are supporting them in their both understanding of others, but also their communication of their own ideas?
Yeah, it's, as I said in my talk, like I hate talking in a group, and here I am right now.
I was thinking that.
Always out of my comfort zone. So first of all, I model that. I tell them, I'm really introverted. I'm really quiet. I actually lend out, I have a couple of extra copies of Quiet and lend them out to my students to let them know there's nothing wrong with them. So it's okay to be quiet and process things quietly. There's nothing wrong with you if you're that quiet person in class. So that's the first thing. But we still need you to open up, because I need to know what's going on in your mind. So, because that's the only way I can assess you. So I need to see it in some form. So, a lot of it comes down to those good strategies we learned with our ELLs, that we've got to give them time to talk with one another. Then there's this fear, especially when you get to controversial topics, like we don't talk about politics and religion outside of the house, and it's like, no, we do that right here. And it's a little terrifying for them. This is the place to practice it and do it wrong, and then learn how to do it right next time, or do it better at least, So we do a lot of prep for things like Socratic seminars, where I tell them you're going to be talking, and I'm going to expect every single one of you to use your talking chips, but we're not going to just jump into talking. So I'm going to give you a day to prep. You can read the text quietly on your own. You can take notes in the multiple forms that we've learned in class. These are going to be our into, through, and beyond questions for Socratic. So That way, you know what the questions are. There's no surprises, right? So to get the kids who are scared of talking, whether it's because they're introverted, like I tell them all the time about me, or because they're scared of saying something politically incorrect or hurting someone's feelings. So I always try to prep them that way. And then setting those norms from the beginning of the year that I will expect you to talk. So what can I do to help you feel safe to talk in class? So that you're free to open up, because whether it's with your partner or a whole class, I need you to do it at some point. I need you to produce language. But then finally, I guess, I know I've talked a lot, but I was giving them the multiple modes to share what they know, right? So we do our Little Big History project, which is the history of an object from the beginning of time in our big history class. And that's like our big culminating presentation. And the kids think a presentation means now they have to stand in front of the class and give a speech, but it doesn't have to be that way. So I give them an extension menu. You want to create a video, and then you don't even have to look at the class, and you've now produced something that we can all learn from. Or, Christina had that great example in her talk, but, or maybe you want to create a timeline and share it with someone and come back and report on what, they got out of it. So I think creating multiple ways to express themselves in the world is also an important skill and helps them feel less scared to participate.
So I just want to name that setting up the routines, really, really crucial. Naming them so they become fluent for the kids and disappear, right? They disappear into the daily practices. But I also heard you be very intentional about setting up those safe environments for kids through practice, time to prep on their own, rehearsal before the conversations, but also setting the expectations that they have to talk. But as you're talking, I'm also thinking and writing down here that you're connecting for me to what Deborah Ball calls eliciting and interpreting student thinking, that formative assessment that we want to lift a kid's head and look inside, right? Yeah. And the ways to do that are getting them to produce in some way. So whether it's listening in as they're talking to each other and building on that learning is social idea, right? Or, and I'm going to go here now, into writing. And this idea of low stakes writing as being a very, very beneficial way. But you know what people will say, so let's take it on, wee bit at a time.
I'll let you go first, Christina. Do you want to go first?
Sure. Low stakes and so I think it might have been in our pre-convos, but I feel like someone said, Annette, you said no stakes writing, right?
Yeah,
no stakes writing. I love that. I actually adopted that into the writing course I'm doing at a college next semester. Thank you, Annette. I'm going to bother you more about that later. But the way I see it, so it's two things for me. First is, so I journal at the beginning of every class with my students. My students spend 5 minutes journaling. I can talk about that process at length with anyone if you want, like here's how I grade it, blah, 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 blah. But the reason I do it, what I tell my students is that writing is like any athletic or performance discipline. And you need to practice. Runners, I'm a distance runner. We do sprints, we do drills, we do footwork drills. Dancers, we do across the floors, we do our kicks and stretches across the floor so that we don't lose that muscle memory. Journaling and low stakes writing are the calisthenics of long writing. Being able to do quick bursts of writing is how you prep for the big game, which is your essay or your timed essay on the SATs or anything like that. It's how you practice. And a lot of writers will tell you, a lot of full-time famous fancy writers will tell you that part of their practice is getting up and writing for a certain amount of time every day and just getting words on paper, because that's so much of a block, I think. And this is part of our cultural obsession with printed text. There's such a fear of when I put words on paper, it has to be perfect. I think that for a lot of people, the affective filter goes up and suddenly they're like, oh God, blank page, I can't do it, I'm not writing. And we need to get our kids to stop being afraid of the blank page, and our adults too. I mean, and me. When I see the blank page, I freak out. I'm like, oh dear God, what am I doing? Aaron Sorkin has this great quote about how the blank page just laughs at you, and it's true. But we need to move past that. The way we move past that is low stakes and no stakes writing. So for me, it's that calisthenics, it's that drills, it's that practice. It's also a chance for you to kind of get out all the gunk that might be covering up the good stuff. So my background is actually in theater and acting. That was one of my majors in college. And I had this solo performance arts professor, Luis Alfaro. He was amazing. And our first day, he made us write and perform the worst one-person show ever. Like, what would be the worst one-person show ever? And so we had like 20 minutes to come up with it and then perform it. And like, they were all bad and terrible. And we were just laughing. And the reason why is because he wanted us to get out of the mindset of perfection. And he wanted us to be able to be silly and to play. And also he said, I want you to get your worst ideas out now. Get them out now so that we can start getting to the good stuff. And that's not to say that everything you do is going to be good, but let's get all of that gunk out of the way so that we can start trusting each other. And that was such a hugely powerful moment as a performer, but also as a writer too. I'll do just like junk drafts, junk it all out, get it all out. Let's get out all the things so that I can start getting to the good stuff. And if you're lucky, sometimes you find some good stuff in the gunk too.
You know, and what a teacher told me, an English teacher recently, she said, have your kids write more than you can grade. Stop feeling guilty. And that really resonated with me because it takes away, like, what's the purpose of this? This isn't so we can just keep on adding to the grade book. It's so that they can get the gunk out, like you said. And then also, I found that if I have them write all those in that exit ticket every day, and then I actually bring up certain points the next day in the classroom discussion from the exit ticket, the kids realize, oh, there's a purpose to expressing myself beyond a grade. And they'll start actually surprising you. They start writing a lot more because they're like, I wonder if I'm going to make it into next day's conversation. So it's no stakes, and it's you know, an opportunity for their little moment of fame that, oh, the teacher actually did read my stuff and she's highlighting it in class.
Love it, love it, love it. It leads me to think about the ways that we motivate and get kids engaged about learning for the sake of learning, right? Again, thinking about the big residual that kids know how to learn, right? Not that, you know, they can Google most stuff, right? So how do you build up their ownership of the learning of their of the content so that they do start to click into that intrinsic motivation and engagement, rather than, you know, grades being used as a carrot or a stick?
So one thing, I mean, at the beginning of the year, I do grade more frequently just so that I can kind of get, you know, my expectations out there and making sure that they're producing quality work. And I noticed someone in the chat was saying it's hard to get kids to work unless it's not for a grade. So I totally am right there with you. Especially during the pandemic, I had to grade everything. But I started letting go after the first unit or so and doing random notebook checks just so that I can raise their level of concern. But then I shift to giving them like a plus delta chart. And so every time I hand back like an important assignment, they have a plus delta chart where the plus being the strengths, any feedback that I gave them that was a strength, and delta is anything that I told them that needs improvement, is area to grow in, right? And so that's kind of how I shift the ownership. I tell them, you know, I said a lot of things about your writing here or about your product that you produced. You can't change everything all at once, and no one's expecting you to be perfect all at once. So what I want you to do is you know, give yourself a pat on the back on what you've grown in, what's your plus, share it with someone, and then circle that delta. What is your next step? What, out of all my feedback, you know, we get all sorts of criticism and feedback from adults all the time in the real world, and it's one ear and out the other, right? But sometimes there's a golden nugget in there. So what's that one thing that you're gonna now work on? Maybe you wanna work on corroborating, maybe you wanna work on citing your evidence correctly, but what are you going to do? And then holding them to that, not necessarily always to my rubric in the traditional sense for the smaller formatives, and, you know, having those talks with them one-on-one. I noticed you said that you were going to work on this. Can I see it in your text? Can you show me? Can you highlight it in your work? And that kind of helps them have some ownership.
Yeah, I really like that, Hajra. I think, letting them see their own progress is huge, and also reminding them of like the things that I'm asking you to do. I make it very much a point of like, I am asking you to do this assignment because you're going to use it here in the essay. Or even like with my low stakes or no, mostly my low stakes writing, like journaling is very low stakes. It is not graded for anything other than did you complete it? And what I tell them is like, athletics is very big at the school that I work at. I have a lot of athletes and a lot of dancers. And I'm like, a lot of you know that you get into something what you put into it. You don't practice fingering skills and and scales on your violin, you're not moving up in chairs. Like you're not able to play that piece with the same dexterity. So a lot of them really understand that metaphor of like the practice makes perfect. So I make it very clear, like we are doing this to support X. I'm having you write journals so that it's easier for you to write an essay later. And I'll also kind of have this point, like I'll skim their journals and just be like, oh yeah, I saw that you did blank this weekend, or like, oh hey, I love watching blank on Netflix too. Just so that they're like, oh, she is reading it, even if it's low stakes. It's like a way to connect with them. I think that's one thing, is to like let them see how it all connects to a bigger picture. But I also think providing choice, like either way, whether it's what they're writing about or how they're writing it, or like what they're creating as a final product. I saw someone in the chat talking about like authentic experiences. Corey, who I know actually, hi Corey. But she was talking about those authentic experiences. The more we can let students choose experiences that feel authentic to them, I think the more that they take ownership of those things.
I agree. And Hajra, it reminds me of you talking about giving kids a plethora of tools and then teaching them how and when to use the tools, but then they've got a choice of tools that they can use for particular purposes. Would you talk a wee bit about that?
So I'll, in my talk, I talk a little bit about note-taking, for example. So, they're taught how to do mind maps, how to look at text or even a video transcript and identify what are the main topics and create outlines for themselves. And then, so I set them up at the beginning of the year with these different strategies. I also teach them different kinds of thinking maps that we use at our school, or graphic organizers, that these are some ways that lend themselves well to history. Perhaps it's like a flow map or a multi-flow map showing cause and causality. So I try to give them this little toolbox, and then before a lesson, I reintroduce those tools. I remind them, remember, these are some tools that we use, or these are some ways that historians think. And so which avenue are you going to use? Are you thinking this is like a controversial article that people might disagree with? And if that's the case, maybe you need to pull out your claim testers from history to check if check the authority, the logic, the intuition, the evidence. Or do you see this article as being like a chain of events, and maybe you need to pull out a flow map, or maybe you don't know much about this topic, and so maybe you need to pull out our changes over time and continuity placemat, because you need some more context for what we're learning. So talking that out and not taking it for granted, because the minute you stop talking about it, they stop doing it. So it's every time I get to an assignment where, that's a little bit more complex, is to then revisit it. Remember, we learned this, this, and this. By the end of the year, they become pretty adept at switching around, but it takes a lot of practice and repetition.
So I want to draw a line between a couple of things that you've talked about in the last bit there, both of you, is this idea of asking the kids what their next step is. I've given you some feedback. Now, what is your next step? So there's choice in what they're going to focus on, right? You've already focused it a little bit because you're tying it to actionable and what the content is at that time. But then also thinking about how they're going to organize themselves to get the work done. Because at the end of the day, what we want is, you did the Salem witch trials with them, right? But you want them to take the same set of skills that they used in discussing and negotiating meaning in that community with looking at Jamestown or the Donner Party or any other similar situation where you have a group of people who are behaving one way or another toward each other. So like, if that's the takeaway, that they can look at the next set of community relationships and consider the context and the cause and the effect, etc., then really those routines help them with self-management, add in the metacognition, and what you're looking for is that deeper understanding. So if we think about literacy as being everything from, Christina, in your talk, from multimedia text, meaning both Mela and Hula, as well as all of the other types. I hope I'm pronouncing them roughly rightly. But when we think of the way that they're taking in meaning through spoken word, different forms, reading a graphic novel, watching a cartoon, a meme, etc., right? So that absorption of meaning, and then thinking about how they're negotiating meaning, whether it's through that very casual talk or casual writing. So no stakes talk and no stakes writing, right? Up through the idea of doing public talks and presentations. How do you see, could you share a story or two about how you see kids going through those multi ways of negotiating language and meaning to being able to develop a deep conceptual understanding of concept in social studies?
Yeah, so I'm thinking a few things. One I'll share, and I hope it's not like too much of a redo, but it's actually something that I shared in the talk that I did. Is I had a student, we were doing independent reading books, and so independent reading books, my students choose a book. They can literally choose any book they want as long as their parent or guardian would be okay with it. And that includes like Green Eggs and Ham. The only thing is that they had to do a 400-word review on it, and I gave them a structure for the review, etc. And I've had some amazing reviews on Green Eggs and Ham and its cultural and its culture and what it means for our culture. And also they had to do some kind of like media project with it. And they have the whole semester to do it, right? And I had one student who really, really struggled to get words on paper. You know, he just struggled. I knew he loved reading. He was really into these sci-fi books. He was like reading a whole series. He absolutely loved it. He could talk with me about it at length, but he had just a really hard time writing about it for any number of reasons, right? So we worked on those things: low stakes writing, outlining, writing in chunks, putting the chunks together, all kinds of things like that. But when the time came for his project, I told him that I really wanted him to focus on that media portion. Like he and I could work on the review, we could work through that, we could scaffold that, but I really wanted him to feel like he could go bananas with this media portion, because he was also very into being creative and games and things like that. And so he kind of like didn't let me know what he was doing. And I was a little worried, like, hey, bud, what's going on? You working on it? What's happening? And he's like, I got it. And what he came back with was he made this flip book on Google Slides. Like he had drawn a template, and then every slide manipulated something different over like 100 slides. So it created this whole scene from the book that he loved. And then he put in the speaker notes why he loved the scene. And for me, that is clearly a student who can decode. He is able to manipulate 100 slides into making a scene that is powerful and sharing a scene that is powerful for him. This is clearly a student who can read and who can express himself. All I had to do was give him the stage to do that. And all of his classmates were like, oh my God, dude, this is wild. Like they were all super into it. And for him, it was such a vote of confidence too, of like, oh, I can express things and people are going to listen. And, you know, at the end of the day, I do think it's good to move away from the idea of producing as far as like we're just producing for a grade. But I think that the idea of producing because my words matter or my ideas matter and people can listen to them is huge. So what I will often show my students, for example, when they're editing and I know that they're all getting a lot of feedback from me on a paper, I will show them a piece that I've written that I've gotten back from an editor with track changes on. And I'm like, you think you have a lot of notes? Look at all of Mrs. Cawdery's notes. Look at the way that this editor slashed my 1,200 word piece to 650 words. And I tell them like, it's a big gut check. It affects me too. Like I've been doing this for years and I still have a gut reaction, but at the end of the day, I believe that this makes my words better. But the editing process is essential for people to actually read my work, make my work readable for someone else, for my audience, right? And so for them, when I show them like, hey, I'm having you write because I think it's really authentic and you could get your words or your ideas out too in a way that's going to be able to share your ideas, you know, do it as a side hustle, whatever, like whatever is going to motivate them. I think that can be really powerful. So I think it helps make it authentic as well. Whether it's like, hey, you could put this slideshow up and people are going to be amazed by it. And you could do it for other things too. And it helps you process information. And let's use that to help you get words on paper so that you can also get your words and your ideas read that way as well. Because that connection matters too.
I love that when the kids have a purpose beyond the grade, it helps get to that intrinsic motivation we were talking about earlier. They realize that it is worth it. That especially in history, if we link it to civic action, right? Yes, fine. We know so much about this topic now. How are we going to take our knowledge and share it with others, and not just create an informational brochure or put out, a tweet, which is like the easiest option sometimes. I'll just put it out there, but no, how are you going to get others to consume your content? How are you going to engage them? And when that purpose is wider, that they start realizing, like you said, that Christina, that words matter. So I love that. That's something I want to work in more into my classroom too.
But it also shares with kids that you feel that they have important things to share, right? And so what I hear you saying, along with kind of questioning the author, not uppercase Beck's work, but this idea that you push back on a text and think about whose voices are missing. All of these are ways to pull in kids who've been previously marginalized. So what other ways do you get kids, because middle and high school, they're starting to pull back from the table, not see school as a place where they belong. How do you pull back in those kids who may not have felt like their voice was valued in the school?
Well, I always go back to how in high school, I was kind of in the track that I was in. I had to take AP European history, and I took it and I liked history and I enjoyed it, but I didn't feel like I was part of it. And so I tell the kids all the time that, you all have a voice somewhere along this timeline in class. Your family had a part in this. They were part of something in here. So I try to do a lot of student surveys at the beginning of the year and then find ways to elevate their voices, whether they're bringing in artifacts from their families. When we get to revolutions, we're in such a culturally diverse area. I have the kids go and research what was going on in their home at that time and have kids share the stories that they feel comfortable with sharing in the class. So wherever there's an opportunity to do so, to let them tell the stories of their family. In Big History at the beginning of the year, we talk about whether you can blend science, cosmology and faith and science all together. And then I have them go home and have a conversation with their parents and record it. And they're terrified about doing that. And I said, I don't care what any of you believe. I just want to see your family dynamics because it matters to me, because then I understand how you interact with difficult ideas, and it's okay. And it gives me such great insight, and it helps me interact with my own students a little bit better for the rest of the year. What about you, Christina?
Yeah, so I think, it's funny, those of some of the folks on here, folks that follow me online, know that I'm a newer mom. I have a 1-year-old, or actually she's like almost 15 months now, I guess. And I'm learning more and more now that she's like a toddler, how much things are about power. Like things are about power and choice and feeling like we are empowered and have power, right? And so I'm realizing and I'm seeing some questions in the chat even about like, how do I balance like giving people like resistant writers low stakes writing or not writing, and also making sure that they still practice writing. And as far as like seeing yourself making kids feel involved, I think a lot of it is about where can we find places to do the easy yes, or like give students the choice. So maybe they do need to write for this, but can I let them choose the topic? Or maybe they do need to write for this, but can I let them choose? Between outlining on a graphic organizer or outlining like with bullet points, right? Like so much I think is where can I find ways to incorporate choice and the yes into something for my students is huge. So that's one thing. And then Hajra, to your point, like I definitely also I grew up in an area where I was like the only brown kid in all of my classes. And so I never saw myself in history classes. And so I think that I love that aspect of bringing them into it. Like where does your family fit in? And I think also having the very real discussion of why aren't we seeing you in this? What happened where that doesn't occur? There's a book I love, and I think it's James Lowith. It's James, and his last name starts with an L-O, but he's got Lies My Teacher Told Me, and he's got Lies My Teacher Told Me, the Young Readers Edition. And both are James Lowen. Thank you. And I think both are really powerful as far as telling students, like, you can be an active reason why we know we can move away from history that doesn't tell complete stories. You can be the change that asks for that. I actually had a student at my school fight for the fact, why don't we teach Filipino history in our school when Filipinos are a huge part of our community out here in Hawaii? And she got it so that, and she's been doing all this programming so that not only my independent school, but the DOE are having to talk about Filipino history in our schools when it's previously been ignored, even though it's a huge part of our history here in Hawaii. So showing them how they can be an active voice in changing the fact that they are not part of the conversation, I think is also huge. And that's why I think, like, not only letting them write, but also that media literacy is very powerful, because we are seeing that's how a lot of movement is being made as well.
Mm-hmm. I love that idea of discussing the undiscussable, Hajra. I cannot tell you how I just burst out in hives immediately at the thought of going home and having that conversation with my family as an adult. So the idea that we're opening up to two-way communication, both within our families and within the school, and giving them practice, as you said, both of you said, to mess up when you're in the safe environment of a classroom, so that when you have these conversations with others, you can make yourself understood and be compassionate and listen to other people as well. There was so much we talked about, but I'm sure there are loads of questions. I see 20,000 comments in the box. Maheen, do you want to maybe name one or two, or close us down, whichever?
Yeah, unfortunately, we're out of time, but the good news is that our after party discussion can keep the combo going. So for all those who submitted questions, or I see a really robust conversation in the chat, please join us in the after party thread. Annette, Christina, Hajra, thank you so much for joining us. What an amazing conversation and discussion. Thank you. Pleasure.
Thank you so much.
All right. So like I mentioned, the after party discussion thread is being posted now into the chat. That was an amazing conversation. Please feel free to click on that link to continue it in our community. We would also love for you to do that 2-question Zoom poll again, so we can get your feedback. We heard from you all, a little more time would be helpful. So we're going to leave it up for around 5 minutes before we move right into our final keynote presentation for the day. So don't go anywhere. Please take that poll, and we'll see you in about 5 minutes.